Hi, this is Congressman Tom Cole, 4th District of Oklahoma. It's another one of our congressional chats. And first, I want to apologize to those of you who follow this feature, and several thousand people do. But we haven't been able to do it the last few weeks for a variety of reasons. We just had scheduling conflicts, July 4th, and quite frankly, I had COVID for a while. So couldn't get it done, but I got through that, by the way, okay. It was good to have had the vaccine, the booster. It was more like a bad cold than anything else, seriously. But for those of you that are concerned, believe me, I'm hale, hearty, and fine, and everything's okay. Congress, the pace of activity really did pick up this week. But before I talk about that, I want to talk about some national news that I think is really what most Americans are thinking about. Now, we had two very important indicators on inflation this week. The consumer price index that went up by 9.1%, the highest in over 40 years. That's year-on-year price increases. That's for everything you buy, but we all know it's worse if it's gasoline, it's worse if it's your rent, it's worse if it's at the grocery store, that the numbers there are all consistently higher than the basic index. That means you're paying more for the things you absolutely have to have. It's hard to economize when it comes to eating or it comes to getting to work and coming home, and certainly the rent's the rent. We've seen a lot of people cancel house purchases because the interest rate's moving up. So, and not to mention the cost of the home itself. So really hit home. And then we saw the day after that, the the producer price index. That's what people pay to buy the materials and things like that that's required to make products. And it was up over 11%. And that suggests inflation's here to stay for a long time. And it certainly will ensure that the Federal Reserve increases interest rates a minimum of 3/4 point. And that means anytime you have to borrow money for a car, for a house, for any other purchase, your credit card, it's going to go up. It's going to be more expensive. That's pretty bleak news for the average American. And we also saw the president off on a foreign trip where, frankly, he's doing something no American president should have to do. He's going around the world begging other countries to produce more oil. Personally, I think he'd be better off to come to Oklahoma City, Dallas, or Houston, not to mention other places in Louisiana and Wyoming, and talk to the American oil companies about what they can do to increase production. Frankly, they're doing that, but we still haven't recovered to the production levels that we had on the eve of the pandemic. And we know we can be energy independent. We know we can be a big help to the rest of the world, both in terms of oil and natural gas. But you've got to have a sign from the leader of the free world and the head of the administration that they're going to be cooperating with you on that they're going to approve pipelines, that they're going to approve leases, and they're going to be reasonable in the permitting process, and they're going to help build the infrastructure that it takes to find, develop, and distribute the product that we're talking about. And none of those signs are coming out of the Biden administration. And I think you see that in your gasoline prices and diesel prices. And then those prices, of course, push up prices on everything you buy. So, pretty grim week for the American consumer. This is attributable, quite frankly, very directly to the Biden administration's policies. Their anti-energy policies, which we saw on day one. They canceled the Keystone Pipeline, made it more difficult to develop our energy assets on federal land and offshore. Frankly, have discouraged investment in the fossil fuel industry. All those things have come home to roost. If you make it harder to produce a product, that product gets more expensive and more scarce, and that's exactly what's happened. And then we saw this explosion of spending. We were coming out of COVID. We had a president inherited an economy that was creating jobs at an extraordinary rate and growing at over 6% in the first quarter. That's what he walked into. He didn't start that. That had started really in the third quarter of 2020 as we were coming out of the shutdown. So he got a great economy, an economy with a 1.4% inflation rate. And rather than simply allow it to continue to develop, he and the Democrats in Congress, through the American Rescue Plan, interjected almost $2 trillion in extra spending. They were warned that was going to cause inflation. Obviously, the Republicans warned them. There wasn't a single Republican vote for this idea. But it wasn't just Republicans. People like Larry Summers, the former treasurer in the Bill Clinton administration, or Steve Radford, the former car czar in the Obama administration. Both of them are noted Democratic economic thinkers. And both of them said, if you do this, you're going to get a big inflation problem. And lo and behold, they turned out to be right. Since that's emerged as the number one issue, we've watched the president try to blame it on the oil companies, or, blame it on Putin, or blame. The reality is he just needs to look in the mirror. This stuff all started. Inflation was running at over 7% before Russia ever went in to Ukraine. I'm not saying that hasn't made things worse. It has, no question about it. But let's be clear about what the root causes of this inflation crisis is. And it's the Biden administration, their anti-energy policy, their reckless spending, and their disregard for solid economic advice, even from their own side of the aisle. So I think those are the dominant stories of the week. Now, in terms of Congress, it's actually been pretty active and, to a degree, reasonably productive. We are moving along in the approach process. We'll be voting on appropriations bills next week. They'll be partisan. There won't be any Republican support for them, but in a sense that's okay because they have to move through the process. And as they move through, we'll be able over time to change them and hopefully by the end of the calendar year come to some sort of larger deal. And when we do that, the deal will be more defense spending, less domestic spending, the return of pro-life hide protections into the appropriations bills, and the elimination of a lot of climate change policies that shouldn't be in appropriations bills, or controversial, expensive, and increase regulation. On the defense end, we actually had a hopeful sign this week. The House passed what's called the National Defense Authorization Act, the so-called NDAA. That's something we've done for 61 straight years. It's almost always a bipartisan exercise. This was no exception this year. A democratically controlled committee, but with strong Republican support, reported out the NDAA out of committee to the floor, 57-1. Every single Republican on the Defense Committee voted for this bill. You say, well, why would they do that if it's a Democratic bill? Well, it's a Democratic bill, but it's a Democratic bill that rejected the president's defense policy. They added $37 billion to what the president had proposed for defense. They increased pay for our soldiers, sailors, airmen, and Marines who are under the same inflationary threats that we face by 4.6%, and they added extra money for the lower ranks who feel this kind of thing, just like lower income Americans do, harder than most. There's acquisition for more ships. We don't decrease the size of the Navy, which is something that the Biden administration proposed. We modestly increase it. And there's also Biden administration that proposed getting rid of 15 AWACS at Tinker Air Force Base. We need to replace them. They're old frames, but the replacements that have been chosen won't come on for 4 or 5 years. We've cut that to 8, and we may be able to reduce it further. To be fair, some of those planes aren't flying now. They're actually being used for spare parts. So it's less dramatic. We made a lot of progress. I want to give my good friend Stephanie Bice, who works on the House Armed Services Committee, a lot of credit for that. She and I have worked together on this issue, on other issues for Tinker Air Force Base, and we certainly got some new money proposed for the new KC-46 tanker that's coming online. And so we're going to continue to work together and make sure that Oklahoma facilities have the infrastructure for the missions they need, and that we guard what's going on. But again, this NDAA bill, it's not without controversy. Some Republicans voted against it simply because of the amount of money. Others because they thought other things should be in it. Very few people voted against it because of what is in it. And voting against a bill because you want something more in it is really sort of silly. You evaluate the bill on what it is. You try to get as much as you can, but again, you have to remember when you're in the minority, and we are. And this was a good bill. All of our members that know anything about defense or that know the most, because I sit on the House Armed Services Committee, voted in favor of it. So that to me was a pretty good indication that that's where we should be, and that's certainly where I was at. And this is an area we need to continue to push the Democrats, but when they respond, as they did in this case, to work with them. Congress will finish today. I'm shooting this on Friday morning, dealing with a couple of abortion bills. I will tell you, these bills are largely messaging bills. They're not going anywhere. The Supreme Court has put that issue squarely back in the hands of the states to decide. We're going to get a variety of decisions there, from very liberal to very conservative. But the point is, the voters in every state will have a chance to shape the policy through their elected officials. It's not going to be decided any longer simply by judges that are unelected and unresponsive, and that frankly tries to impose a one-size-fits-all policy across the country. So count me as thinking that's a good thing, not a bad thing. But again, we'll have some fireworks over that, but they're not going. This legislation is not going anywhere in the United States Senate. This is strictly an effort to use it to try and score political points, as opposed to sit down and see if there's something that can be done in common. And frankly, what the Democrats are proposing is extraordinarily radical. It's not Roe v. Wade, which allowed the states to regulate abortion in the second and the third trimester. This would allow abortion literally up to the moment of birth in all states. It would get rid of all pro-life legislation at the state level in every state in America. So you couldn't have a modulated approach where people decide what they want to do. But anyway, this is, as I said, a mixed bag. We also passed some legislation out of the House to help our veterans who've had ailments associated with burn pits. This is something that had not been covered in the past and needed to get covered. It's not a perfect bill. There's certainly some things I would have done differently, but I was proud to support it. You have to remember, when men and women put their lives on the line for the country and suffer harm as a result, they deserve the support of the American taxpayer. That's what Americans have always wanted us to do. I was proud to work with my friends across the aisle on a bipartisan basis and make sure that was passed. So again, Congress got some things done, got something done for our veterans, got an important measure passed for defense, and we'll move into next week, I think, working on appropriations, actually, again, getting things done. But again, the dominant message is the bad Democratic policies that were initiated from the very outset of this administration. That is too much spending and too much regulation and an anti-energy policy have all come home to roost. We saw it dramatically this week. I think, sadly, we're going to see it in the weeks and months ahead. It's going to take a while to get this under control, and it's going to be a painful process. And but that's something that, frankly, is at the president's doorstep and at the doorstep of the Democratic majorities in both houses of Congress. They're the ones that implemented these policies, and frankly, they're the ones that probably will pay a political price for them later this year. With that, I hope you tune back in next week. I look forward to visiting with you again.